Hey guys, this is the lecture video for Module 21, the Reformation, Lesson 1. I'm going to put this in Edpuzzle. This was originally a Pear Deck presentation, so we're going to combine the two so you guys can answer the questions as we go along in Edpuzzle, and I can check them later. So we're going to begin with the issues with the Catholic Church. I believe that you're aware that there was a lot of corruption, problems, and issues that had kind of infiltrated the Catholic Church. And so by the time we get to this period, the Reformation, which is the movement to reform Christianity, reform meaning to change, to erase corruption, and to focus more on religion. So, why were they corrupt and why was the church unpopular? Well, number one, they criticized the behavior of priests, bishops, and popes and the things that they were doing, such as investiture. So, priests and bishops, they didn't really quite have the education, perhaps they did today, same standards. And then this issue of investiture, which we have talked about before. Investiture is when kings, rather than the church, would appoint bishops, and that obviously led to corruption. So, because no major governments were around with that Roman Empire collapsing and leaving kind of Europe, there's this big vacuum of power. And really, the Roman Catholic Church stepped in there for a while. So, whereas a bishop would be like a leader, manager, organizer for the Catholic Church of a certain region, state type area, obviously, they are, only in a religious position today. But back then, they also had some political power as well and responsibility. And so, who got to choose their man to be in those positions was a power struggle. One of the second issues was the Avignon papacy. This is kind of an interesting story in the sense that, the popes had largely been Italian for a number of years, while one of the popes moved to southern France, as it says, by the invitation of the king. While there, I believe the pope died, and they elected the pope then and there, and the French cardinals had a lot of say in it. And so they elected like a French pope, and he moved the papacy to Avignon, which is technically still in Italy, but was just a hop, skip, and a throw from France, and so largely looked like he was under the control of the French king. So, of course, what they did was many bishops, they're the ones responsible for electing the Pope. They went home to Rome and they said, hey, that one Pope, he doesn't count, so let's elect a new one. So then they elected a new Pope, and there were two Popes. And this went on for many, 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 many years. And so then they said, look, this is a problem, this is an issue, let's forget Pope 1 and 2 and let's start over and let's elect a third Pope, which does not seem like the best answer either. And so it was a huge mess. And it goes into like people losing the confidence in the church. The Pope was seen as like the single representative of Christ on earth. Well, what happens when you have three popes then? You know, it was very confusing and just very frustrating for a number of the people at the time. And then at the lowest level, priests, they took on these positions and jobs because they wanted the money, they wanted the salary as a result of it. They didn't know basic church teachings, they were too involved in politics. Like, there was just too many problems from the top all the way down to the bottom. Moving on, we've got the wealth of the church. Obviously, at this point, they had a great deal of money that they have amassed, with people donating, giving money to them after their deaths and things like that. And plus, they didn't have to pay taxes in the different states that are rising up. When I say states, I mean countries. It's another name for that. Also, you guys are aware of the indulgences. Those are the penalties for sins that people had committed. People could pay to get rid of those penalties. And that's what an indulgence is. So you can, pay to be forgiven, basically. Simony, which is going to be the selling of church positions or other benefits the church could offer. Church positions, those are jobs, right? So if you get into that job, then you get a salary. And unfortunately, people would hold three different jobs and things like that. So, can you imagine a pastor, being a pastor at St. Paul and at Bethany and at Royal Redeemer? He would get three incomes, great for Pastor Smith, right? But obviously, one pastor could not do all of the work for all three churches. And so there was a lot of holes and a lot of places that just didn't have the representation that they needed. And then, it's corrupt. You're buying a position. That would probably be the definition of corruption. Next, you've got this idea of purgatory. This is an idea that kind of Catholics believed in. They get this idea from there's a set of the books that were published between the Old Testament and the New Testament that the Catholics kind of give a little bit of authority to. And so that's where they get the idea of purgatory. But as a Lutheran, we obviously do not recognize any writings other than the Old Testament and the New Testament. So we strictly do not believe in a purgatory. I think officially Catholics still kind of believe in a purgatory. I don't think it's talked about. I don't think it's pushed. I don't think it's one of those main ideas. But basically, it's this idea that after you die, it's this in between place between heaven and hell. And that's where you're punished for your sins. And so indulgences and other things could be paid for loved ones so that they didn't have to spend time in purgatory. And so, you're basically paying for yourself and you're paying for your loved ones to go into heaven. And, as you saw in the Luther movie, poor people who couldn't even afford things, they would be giving money to the church and they couldn't even afford their own, rent or for food and things like that because they're just considered very, they were thinking of their loved ones and they didn't want them to suffer. This brings us now to people who began reforming the church. As you saw on the other slide, there was originally Desiderius Erasmus, people who were calling for reform. There were other people who were kind of criticizing the Catholic Church. Jan Hus from the Czech Republic was one of those. They all ended up burning at the stake because the Catholic Church, being that powerful, arrested them and charged them with heresy. So by this time, the fact that Martin Luther is going to kind of like stand out and be able to challenge the church and not, get stopped for it is kind of impressive. Now, you saw the movie, there was a great danger to his life. It wasn't like everything was great for him. But other people had attempted but had failed. Let's talk about with Martin Luther. You know that he was a Catholic priest. You know that he was a monk. He taught. He read the scriptures. Was very well knowledgeable of all of those things. And so, on October 31st, 1517, he nailed the 95 Theses to that door in Wittenberg. He wanted to create a discussion. He wanted to reform the church. There was no, malicious intent to this. Like he wanted improvement. And so one of the things that made him so popular was the printing press by this point. The printing press, they got his ideas, they typed it up, and they copied this all over Germany at that time. And Germany, he's from a northern part of it. So it's kind of important that he's of Germany on the farther side of where the Catholic Church would be. Southern Germany is still going to be largely Catholic, but that northern Germany is going to be pretty far away. Um, so obviously lots of issues that are going to be posted in that 95 Theses. We'll look at some examples of that, but it's going to criticize the church and it's going to criticize those indulgences. Eventually, he'll be labeled a heretic. He'll be excommunicated, kicked out of the church. There's several um, councils, meetings in which they're going to try to get him, to repent and things like that. And he's just not going to do it. And so he actually had the help of the Prince of Saxony there, who actually hid him in an attic for an entire year, protecting him while his ideas just went all over Germany and other parts of Europe. And they were largely popular because people were kind of feeling the same thing. And so people who sided with Luther, who were protesting against the Catholic Church, are going to be labeled Protestants. We're going to Luther's teachings, you got to be pretty familiar with them. We all have a direct relationship to God. We don't need to pray to Mary. We don't need to pray to the saints. As a result, so we pray directly to God and to Jesus. We believe in the Bible and the Old Testament, New Testament, not on traditions, not on what the Pope has said, not on other things like that. And during that year of hiding, Martin Luther, he translated the New Testament into German, which was incredible because it was only published or written, well, it was only written in Latin. So the fact that he was able to translate it and people could get their hands on it because they knew and understood German, they obviously had not studied Latin. This is like everyday people finally had control and had access to the Bible, which was just incredible for them. Other things, other people are going to be inspired by this. William Tyndale, you'll need to know he is the English professor who's going to kind of adapt that and translate their Bible into English. He'll be executed for that because it's not going to be a popular idea. John Calvin is going to be a very big name. He's going to believe in this idea called predestination. And predestination is not something that Lutherans that Lutherans believe in. Martin Luther will reject that idea. But basically, you've got this splintering of groups now. Luther protested. Other people are going to protest, not quite agreeing with what Martin Luther did. And that's where you've got all of these different denominations. And the Calvins will settle mainly in Geneva, Switzerland. And then you've got Henry VIII, who's an interesting guy. He'll start the English Reformation, but not for religious ideas. He actually was very Catholic, except he started the Reformation. Because he wanted a divorce. He asked the Pope for a divorce from his first wife, and he wouldn't grant it because his mistress at the time was pregnant, and he was very obsessed with having a boy as legitimate heir. There was a lot of, in the 1400s, War of the Roses, a lot of problems and issues with uh, who had like a claim to the throne and legitimacy, and so he didn't want anything like that to happen. And so his first wife was Catherine from Spain, and she had given birth to a daughter named Mary, and then he wanted a divorce, and so because of the close connections between Spain and the Pope, the Pope wouldn't grant it. So he started the Reformation. He basically just took the Pope off of the organization of the Church of England, put himself at the head, gave himself a divorce, and then married his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And then with the story of Henry VIII, he ended up having 6 wives in his lifetime. So, but that's how the English Reformation basically kind of took place in England.